Imagine waking up one day and discovering that your house is worth half of what it was yesterday. Not because of a hurricane, not because of a war, but because the system decided it should be. Tokyo, December of 1989. The Nikkei index reaches nearly 40,000 points. Land in the Ginza district is worth more per square meter than all of Manhattan. 1 year later, half of that value simply vanishes. You believe it was an unavoidable economic accident. But what if I told you it was a deliberate choice? What if the largest financial bubble in modern history didn't burst on its own, but was carefully punctured? They tell the story like this. Japan got drunk on success in the 1980s. Companies were buying skyscrapers in New York. Banks were lending money using land worth imaginary fortunes as collateral. It was unsustainable. The bubble had to burst. Cause and effect. Pure economic physics. Except it wasn't. In Tokyo's financial core, between 1986 and 1987, the Bank of Japan made a decision that would change decades. It cut the discount rate from 5% to 2.5%. Cheap credit flooded the system. It wasn't irrational greed, it was deliberate monetary policy. Go back with me to September of 1985. At the Plaza Hotel in New York, 5 countries meet in secret: the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. The Plaza Accord. Official goal: reduce the American trade deficit. Real goal: force the Japanese yen to appreciate. And it worked. The yen soared 46% in just over a year. Japanese exports, the engine of its economy, began to suffer. Tokyo's response? Flood the domestic market with liquidity. Turn credit into abundant oxygen. The problem is that too much oxygen near the fire doesn't extinguish the flames. It multiplies the blaze. Between 1987 and 1990, Japan's GDP grew 5.5% per year. Unemployment hovered around 2%. On the streets of Shibuya and Shinjuku, young salarymen celebrated in expensive karaoke bars, convinced the Japanese model had triumphed over Western capitalism. But in the corridors of the Bank of Japan and the offices of the Ministry of Finance, another narrative was unfolding. Asset inflation needed to be contained. And it was. Between May of 1989 and August of 1990, interest rates rose from 2.5% to 6%. Simultaneously, the government introduced a 3% consumption tax. These weren't adjustments. They were emergency brakes slammed at full speed. The Nikkei plunged from 39,000 to 20,000 points. Land prices in Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya went into free fall. By 1992, they had lost more than 50% of their value. Banks that had lent billions, backed by real estate, suddenly held worthless paper. But here's the question no one asks. Why didn't the banks recognize those losses immediately? Why did they keep zombie companies alive, refinancing unpayable debts? The answer is cultural and political. In Japan, bankruptcy isn't just bankruptcy. It's collective shame, a rupture of social order. And so, the corporate zombies were born. Companies technically dead, sustained by financial transfusions, occupying space, consuming resources, preventing renewal. Provocative transition. You think you know what a recession looks like: numbers falling, unemployment rising, government reacting. But Japan didn't have an ordinary recession. It had something far more sinister, an economy that kept functioning while dying slowly from within. And the price wasn't paid in balance sheets, it was paid in human lives. There was a social contract in post-war Japan. You studied hard, got into a good university, were hired by a major corporation right after graduation, and worked there until retirement. Lifetime employment, mutual loyalty, intergenerational stability. That contract was torn apart between 1993 and 2004. At the universities of Waseda, Keio, and Tokyo, young graduates discovered that the doors of big corporations were closed. The employment rate for new graduates plummeted to 60%. The employment ice age was born. Shushoku Hyogaki in Japanese, an expression carrying the weight of an entire generation frozen in limbo. These young people didn't become traditional unemployed workers. They became freeders, temporary laborers, bouncing from gig to gig. Convenience stores in Akihabara, ramen shops in Ikebukuro, jobs that pay enough to survive, but never to build. The share of temporary and contract workers jumped from 20% in the 1980s to 40% in the 2000s. It wasn't accidental precarization. It was strategic restructuring. Companies discovered they could protect profit margins by hiring disposable labor. The lifetime employment system didn't collapse under external pressure. It was dismantled from within. In the suburbs of Tokyo, Yokohama, and Saitama, a phenomenon began to appear. Men and women in their 30s, 40s, 50s still living with their parents. The parasite singles. The term sounds cruel because it was designed to be cruel. In 2016, 4.5 million Japanese aged 35 to 54 lived under their parents' roofs. Not by choice, but by impossibility. Unstable jobs don't generate enough income for rent, marriage, or children. The birth rate began to plummet. By 2015, 1 in every 4 men and 1 in every 7 women at age 50 had never married. Not because they rejected marriage, but because they couldn't afford it. Then came the most disturbing phenomenon, the hikikomori. Young people, mostly men, who simply withdrew from society. Locked in rooms, avoiding human contact, surviving in the shadow of aging parents. Estimates range from 50,000 to 1.2 million cases. 60 to 80% are men. It's not laziness. It's not individual weakness. It's psychological collapse in the face of a system that promised meaning through work and then removed the work without offering new meaning. Japanese culture calls them the 8,000 and 80-year-old parents supporting 50-year-old recluses. When the parents die, what's left? The artist Tetsuya Ishida captured it in haunting paintings. Young people fused with washing machines, bodies turned into industrial products, faces erased in urban crowds. Ishida lived through the lost decade. He died in 2005 at 31, hit by a train. His works are not metaphors, they are records. In the late 1990s, while he painted those images, Japan's suicide rate surpassed 30,000 per year. To this day, forests like Aokigahara, at the foot of Mount Fuji, carry a dark reputation as final destinations. Not because the place is cursed, but because despair needs geography. Provocative transition. While a generation was being devoured from within, Japan was still treated as a global economic power. But something fundamental had changed. The country that once threatened American hegemony in the 1980s was now negotiating on its knees. And few realized that wasn't an accident either. In the 1980s, Washington feared Tokyo. Japan's trade surpluses were growing. Companies like Sony, Toyota, and Mitsubishi were buying iconic American assets. The Rockefeller Center was sold to Japanese investors. Analysts predicted Japan would become the world's largest economy. American politicians demanded protectionism. The term Japan bashing entered the vocabulary. Then came the Plaza Accord, then the bubble, then the stagnation. And magically, Japan bashing disappeared. Clinton, in the 1990s, still pressured Tokyo in trade disputes over auto parts. In 1995, he threatened tariffs unless Japan opened its markets. But the tone had changed. It was no longer fear, it was condescension. Japan's stagnation perfectly coincided with America's tech boom. While Tokyo sank into deflation, Silicon Valley exploded. While Japanese banks were cleaning up bad loans, Wall Street was inventing new financial instruments. American hegemony was restored not just militarily, but economically. And Japan, a crucial strategic ally in East Asia, remained dependent on the American security umbrella. U.S. military bases in Okinawa. Renewed defense agreements, the power dynamic solidified. But the final irony came from China. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. Japanese exports to the mainland skyrocketed. Tokyo found a new growth engine. Between 2003 and 2007, GDP grew 1.8% per year. Banking reforms reduced non-performing loans by more than 70%. Unemployment fell. Some even declared the lost decade over. Until 2008 arrived the global financial crisis. And Japan realized it had traded dependence on the United States for dependence on China. Tensions over the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea escalated. Memories of World War II once again poisoned diplomacy. Japan never regained the economic autonomy of the 1980s. In the 2010s, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe launched Abenomics. 3 arrows: massive monetary stimulus, fiscal spending, and structural reforms. The Bank of Japan once again flooded the system with liquidity. Negative interest rates, asset purchases on an unprecedented scale. The yen depreciated. Exports rose. The Nikkei climbed again. But wages remained stagnant. Public debt surpassed 250% of GDP. The population kept aging. The birth rate kept falling. The structural reforms never truly arrived. Because structural reforms mean altering the social pact. It means questioning lifetime employment, corporate loyalty, seniority-based hierarchies. It means admitting that the model that built post-war Japan no longer works. So, what was truly lost in the lost decade? It wasn't just economic growth. It wasn't just jobs. It was collective faith in a narrative, the belief that hard work, education, and institutional loyalty guarantee a future. That the system takes care of those who serve it. An entire generation of Japanese discovered those promises were conditional. And when the conditions changed, the promises evaporated. The artist Tetsuya Ishida painted young people turning into machines because he understood the system had always seen them that way, not as individuals with inherent dignity, but as cogs. And when cogs break, you replace them. Today, economic observers debate whether Japan has finally escaped deflation, whether Abenomics worked, whether the lost decade became 3 lost decades, but they ask the wrong questions. The issue isn't whether GDP grew again. It's what happens to a society when the social contract is broken and never renegotiated. It's what it means when millions live in permanent precarity while institutions pretend normalcy. It's what remains when an entire generation is sacrificed to preserve the structure that failed it. Japan's lost decade isn't ancient history. It's prologue. Every economy inflating asset bubbles while wages stagnate is repeating the opening chapters. Every government that socializes banking losses while privatizing profits is following the same script. Every generation of young people working temp jobs without stability is living the same narrative with a different accent. Japan doesn't teach us how to avoid collapse. It teaches how collapses can be managed, prolonged, normalized. How systems can keep functioning even after dying inside. The final lesson of the lost decade isn't in the numbers. It's in the faces painted by Tetsuya Ishida. In the locked rooms of the hikikomori. In the parasite singles, who know their elderly parents are the only pillar standing between them and the abyss. It's in the realization that it wasn't impersonal market forces that destroyed futures. It was choices. Choices to keep banks alive instead of people. Choices to preserve structures instead of dignity. And those choices have names, addresses, meeting minutes. The market has no conscience. But those who run it do. And they decided that an entire generation was an acceptable cost for institutional stability. It wasn't a lost decade. It was a sacrificed generation. And it still is.